to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. If you heard last week's podcast on California and New York's quest for single payer, well, that's not the only thing California and New York have in common. This week, we look at both states' climate change policies. Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chatted with Wayne Winegarden, PRI's Senior Director of our Center for Business and Economics. Wayne discusses his new study, Legislating Energy Poverty, a case study of how California's and New York's climate change policies are increasing energy costs and hurting the economy. Will California and New York's climate change policies really make a significant dent at changing the weather? Unfortunately, both states' politicians seem to put that goal ahead of helping people out of poverty. Thanks for joining us. So in legislative poverty, you make the case that politicians in California have adopted a big government approach to cutting emissions that are simply unaffordable for many people. Explain what you mean.
What I mean is California, they view themselves as a leader in global climate change policies and of taking the government and making policies, whether it's cap and trade or forcing all new homes to include solar panels when you build them. And so they're using all of these policies to direct the way the energy infrastructure should look that conforms with what they believe is the best kind of energy system that they expect will kind of meet all of their goals. You know, their overarching goal is to raise the cost of traditional or disfavored energy sources and subsidize their preferred sources, which is generally wind or solar. And of course, you know, when you subsidize something, that money has to come from somewhere. So whether they're increasing costs of traditional or having a subsidy, they're increasing costs of Californian. And they've done that to such a large extent that for many Californians, they've made energy just simply unaffordable.
So, Wayne, being a California-based think tank, we're naturally focusing on the Golden State's big government energy policies, but you actually spend a good chunk of your study talking about New York's energy policies. So, for those of us who aren't as familiar with what's going on in the Empire State, what's their energy policy approach?
It's very similar to California's. I actually chose to look at both California and New York because they are viewed as the leaders in kind of their approach to global climate change policies, which again, that's like the cap and trade, renewable energy mandates. So in New York, they're going to say there should be a 50% renewable energy by 2030. They have efficiency standards, net metering programs, standards on emissions of vehicles. They subsidize electric vehicles. All of these policies and programs that the state does by, again, penalizing fossil fuels or giving money to people with the preferred energy sources. That's what both California and New York have in common. It's what in the study we call the California-New York approach. And it's predicated on the belief that they know what the best course of action should be in response to the global climate change concerns. And they want to empower government to do what they think is the best approach, whether it is or not, is not really a concern.
California made national headlines in recent months for adopting a 100% renewable energy goal. New York has a similar goal, 50% goal on the books. It sounds like a good idea, but you make the case that these renewable energy mandates are increasing electricity costs. How so?
I think to answer this question, it's important to distinguish between the power source and the mandate. Right? So to take solar energy as the example, right? There are many places in the country, some of which in California, right, where solar energy is a competitive source, or it's becoming a competitive source, and in response, you see people are voluntarily moving towards solar energy. There's many examples of this, and that's great. That's the way things are supposed to happen. The problem comes from the mandates, because there are many other instances where solar is not yet the answer because of technological constraints, or it may never be the answer. And the same goes for wind power. And so the problem is by forcing the grid to adopt these technologies on a specific time frame, right, beyond what right now they're currently capable of providing, that reduces the efficiency of the current power grid. That increases costs. That creates a less reliable, less stable kind of energy infrastructure. And that's where a lot of the cost on low-income Californians, but really all of Californians stems from.
So, Wayne, one of the energy challenges that you highlight in your study is how these policies have a very different impact on the different communities in each state. So, for example, example, the energy mandates aren't really impacting coastal communities in California, which have a more temperate climate, but they're significantly impacting power bills in the rural, inland, and minority communities in California. So could you share with our listeners how California's big government energy policies are hurting the state's most vulnerable communities?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is one of the most important kind of messages to kind of get out there in terms of what our research found. And, California really is an important example that illustrates this because of the dichotomy in both the climate and in terms of where kind of high-income communities and low-income communities kind of live, right? Many kind of California residents, they live along the coast, and because of those climatic advantages, they just don't use energy intensively as the rest of California or as the rest of the country. And that actually makes the kind of the California-New York approach look less costly than it actually is. But those advantages disappear pretty quickly as you move eastward, right? So those communities, they not only tend to have lower incomes, but they have larger energy needs, whether it's because they have to drive further or because it's less temperate, so they need kind of more energy to cool their homes in the summer or even more to warm their homes in the winter. And so that result is that you kind of have that double impact on the low-income communities. They require more energy, so they're going to naturally bear a larger amount of the costs from the global climate change policies that are being implemented, and yet they're less able to bear those costs from the policies, and that just leads to the inescapable conclusion that it's the poor and the middle class who are bearing the largest burden from California's energy mandates.
Previously documented in your study, Costly Subsidies for the Rich, lawmakers are pushing expensive electric car subsidies to try and encourage people to buy higher-priced electric cars. You found in your research that these are just giveaways for wealthy households. So this begs the question, should government really be encouraging people to buy electric cars or any type of car in the first place?
Absolutely not. I mean, that's just not a role for the government at all. And you can really identify two separate problems with these types of subsidies. First is just the regressivity problem that we just discussed, right? The subsidies are funded from tax revenues, right? So lower and middle income families are contributing their taxes into the state, and so they're going to bear those costs, either higher taxes, fewer public services, however you want to document those. But they also can't afford to purchase electric cars, right? Either they're very expensive, and even if they become less expensive, there's use limitations on electric cars. They can't drive as far on a single charge. They require an impractical amount of time to recharge. And there's also the issue, if you don't actually have a garage, I mean, just very banal but important issues. If you don't have a garage, where do you charge up the car? Right? And that becomes a very important constraint as well. So here's families that are contributing money to the government to cover these subsidies, and that's a bad thing, that's regressive, but they're going to get none of the benefits because they don't purchase these cars, and these cars are not useful for them. So there's a kind of a double regressivity impact. But there's another problem with these subsidies as well that I think is less seen, but is just as important. And I think ethanol, that case study, is an important illustration of the problem, right? Ethanol, right, or getting gasoline from corn or other types of crops, that was once viewed as the answer, right? They said, oh, well, here's a clean fuel, until we realized that, whoops, it's more expensive. It has a higher carbon footprint, so we're not addressing the emissions that people want to address. And it raises food costs. So there's an awful kind of unintended consequence from these policies, right? Nobody in government predicted the fracking revolution that actually has reduced carbon emissions. Nobody predicted those unexpected impacts. Yet, here we are. We're stuck with this program that is actually worse for the environment, raises food costs, increases costs on people for the gasoline. It just makes no sense. And that's the problem with government mandates, right? It's not that the government is necessarily wrong or right more often than the private sector. It's that the government sector can't learn from its mistake while the private sector does.
Wayne, in addition to electric car subsidies, both New York and California have adopted tough vehicle emission standards, and California additionally has adopted restrictions on oil and gas production. So this begs the question, are these policies effective at cutting emissions? What does your research tell you about the impact of these policies on emissions and people's energy burdens?
They're not effective at cutting emissions. And in fact, the policies could have the opposite effect, right? Think about in California, right? All of these costly mandates, they penalize manufacturing in California, right? So to the extent that this activity is pushed toward other more carbon-intensive locations, then the policies are not reducing global emissions at all. And in fact, it could be increasing them depending upon kind of where that production activity goes to, right? And there's another question that all of this begs, which we discussed in the paper, and that's how do you properly measure a state's emissions, right? In the case of California, if you measure emissions based on what Californians consume rather than what we produce, well, we consume cars and all sorts of products that are associated with high emissions. And in fact, what you see is that California's emissions based on our consumption is not nearly as kind of wonderful as we like to pronounce if you do it based on what's produced. And so I think when you take all of those together, what you're seeing is that these really aren't effective at reducing emissions, but they are very effective at burdening people, increasing costs, and kind of decreasing the prosperity that we really need. That's always the solution to kind of social problems.
One argument for proposals like electric car subsidies and the solar roof initiative is that working class households will save through lower energy costs. But we know that since California has pursued big government energy policies, that electricity prices have actually gone up. Should we expect the same under these new proposals like solar panel mandates, which of course will drive the price of housing?
This always reminds me of the old joke, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? There's just several problems with this argument, right? First, right, the savings depend on the specific assumptions that often just don't hold in reality. Or if they do hold in reality on average, they're not going to necessarily hold for specific families. So if I'm not going to use energy or electricity in a manner that a solar panel saves me money, it doesn't benefit me to know that the average family didn't have to spend more money, because for me it made no sense, right? So that general, even if it does hold in general, which the research says that's not the case, it's kind of a best case example. Who is the government to determine that how much I'm going to use a product and whether or not the upfront cost can be made up for in terms of all the back end savings? That's just just the height of just kind of arrogance kind of in that assumption. Lastly, even if we kind of grant all of these assumptions to say, okay, the calculation is correct, that still doesn't solve the problem for many people that even if that can make the savings up over 10, 15 years, I just don't have the income to spend that much more for a dishwasher or for a house or wherever you've thrown down this subsidy, these mandates to make that payment today. So even if you grant all those assumptions, it's, I think, very rational for a lot of people to say, I can't afford that. And that's another important constraint that people tend to overlook, but is incredibly impactful and also important in terms of the overall theme of harming the middle and low income families.
Wayne, when politicians in California and New York get on their soapbox to promote these policies, they say that they are essential to cutting emissions and saving the planet. Yet your research has found that some, what we might consider untraditional environmental champions like West Virginia and Ohio are actually cutting emissions at a faster rate than California and New York. So what are these states doing that's working?
The intermediate answer, I guess you would say, has been and always has been natural gas. Right? And when you look at the fracking revolution, which we mentioned briefly earlier, that has been, and this is the Department of Energy stating this, that has been a main driver of our reduction in emissions. And I don't know if this is kind of well known because of all of the kind of hyperbole that goes around this issue, but we actually in the United States have seen more emissions reductions than the vast majority of countries out there. Now, of course, our emissions on a per capita basis in an absolute has been higher, but we still have seen a 14% reduction since 2007. And that's due to natural gas. That's due to the fracking revolution. And now we have natural gas that's cheaper than coal, that has lower overall emissions than coal. And so we have a market-tested, market-proven product that can provide stable, cheap electricity and energy to the economy, so it's pro-growth, and it's also reducing our emissions. And so this is kind of a market-driven transformation. It's not based on some sort of results in a lab. It's not based on anything, we'll have new technologies in the near future that will address these obstacles. This exists today. And so I think that's incredibly important. And what's also important is not only does it exist today, but it's what they call in the industry dispatchable energy, which means we can turn it on when we need it and we can turn it off when we don't. You don't have that advantage when you look at solar, when you look at wind. And so that makes the quality of energy, if you can refer to it in that way, from natural gas, that much more important to the economy. And so West Virginia and Ohio, again, they started from higher per capita emissions, but they've been seeing that transformation, and that transformation has helped reduce their emissions while also avoiding the cost that's associated with the California or the New York approach.
So in Legislating Energy Poverty, your study, you make the case that lawmakers in California and New York should think twice about creating additional big government energy policies and instead consider free market alternatives that don't raise taxes, increase cost, or create unaffordable mandates and programs. What are some of these alternatives that states like California should be embracing? And why do you think they persist when their big government approach, when market policies have been shown to be more effective in cutting emissions?
Let's start with the latter question, right? I think they persist for that same kind of fatal conceit, if I can use that term, that Friedrich Hayek pointed out almost a half century ago, right? That they imagine that they can design the economy about which they actually know very little about. And so there's this belief that, these technologies are here, we can create this clean, as they would call it, energy system, and we know how everything will respond, and we know that we'll have economic growth and kind of reduced emissions. And the bottom line is their approach increases cost, and increasing cost and decreasing quality does not create a policy that increases economic growth. They're just kind of diametrically opposed to one another. And so what the states should be doing is empowering individual entrepreneurs, right, to design kind of the new clean tech consumers, because it's through that private experimentation that we're going to see kind of better and technologically feasible solutions emerge. Again, embracing the fracking revolution. That's an incredibly important technology that, again, cheaper, better, and lower emissions. I mean, that's just really, it's a no-brainer, and it's a way that we can encourage economic growth and have fewer emissions. Again, it just is something that it makes no sense to discourage, which both California and New York are doing. And the other thing is really to make sure that the ideas rise and fall on their own merits. Perhaps solar is going to be viable. Perhaps it's going to be something completely different. But we need to allow experiments to succeed or fail on their merits, because that's the best way, in any industry, but especially something as important as energy, to get to the kind of new energy sources and the technological improvements that we're really looking for the future.
Thanks, Wayne.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks again to our colleague Wayne Winegarden. You can find Legislating Energy Poverty, as well as all of Wayne's great work, on PRI's website at pacificresearch.org. And if you're in the Orange County, California area, mark your calendars for Wednesday, January 16th for our luncheon with Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute. Heather will discuss her new book, The Diversity Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. And if you're in the San Francisco area, mark your calendars for a luncheon with Steve Moore on January 24th. Details of both events are on the PRI website. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.